Welcome back to The Heat. Are we living during a time of historic change where the international balance of power is being transformed? That's the big question as I continue my conversation with the Chief Foreign Affairs Commentator for the Financial Times, Gideon Rachman. He is the author of the new book, Easternization, Asia's Rise and America's Decline. Gideon, let's talk about some of the consequences about what you're talking about. There's some political scholars who believe that stability happens in a unipolar world. In this case, the United States is the most powerful nation in the world and is able to make sure that international rules are followed, that if we have a multipolar world with different centers of power, that we won't have stability. Do you believe that to be the case?
Well, I think it's an open question, but it's interesting that even the Chinese leadership are considering that whether their rise, their peaceful rise, as they like to call it, will always be peaceful, because there is, as you say, a body of scholarship which argues that particularly moments in history when there's a rising power that is challenging the position of an established power are dangerous and that they lead to wars. There's a scholar at Harvard called Graham Allison who's called this Thucydides' trap, a reference to the ancient Greek historian's argument that war between Sparta and Athens happened because one of these power shifts. And I was very interested when I was in Beijing. I go every now and then, and I was there in October 2013 and was part of a group that saw President Xi Jinping in the Great Hall of the People. And when he spoke to us, about 20 of us, he actually explicitly referred to Thucydides' trap, to Allison's work, and said it's our duty to try to avoid these kind of destructive tensions between rising and established powers. So clearly the Chinese leadership, perhaps even harder than the American leadership, is thinking about how to manage this transition, because they know, I think they know that they feel they have a legitimate ambition, fair enough, for China's economic power to be given more political expression, and particularly perhaps in their own region where they have many territorial disputes, as you know. But they also are aware that America is the dominant power in the region, and that could lead to conflict, and how to manage what they regard as China's legitimate aspirations without sliding into a conflict with the United States is the biggest geopolitical question facing them and probably the world.
And this danger of conflict comes about because we have these rival power centers struggling for what, dominance?
Yeah, I mean, I guess they wouldn't put it quite as bluntly as that, but yeah, I mean, I think that both the US and China, particularly in Asia, believe that they have entrenched national interests which involve not compromising on what the Chinese call their core national interests, whether that be Taiwan or the South China Sea. And the US, particularly in the South China Sea, believes that it too has core national interests. And one of the things in the book is when Hillary Clinton says in, I think it's 2010, America has an interest in the South China Sea, we're not just going to back off. And since then, you've had this increasing jostling. And I must say that actually, I think the Americans have been slightly wrong-footed in the last couple of years by this program of island building that the Chinese have undertaken, building up reefs that they claim are theirs, but they've sort of done land reclamation and built airstrips on them and so on. The Americans believe that those are actually military bases in the offing, and have been trying to push back by running freedom of navigation operations, as they call them, basically sending the US Navy past these reefs. But these reefs are now established. They're sort of facts on the ground, or on the water, if you like. And it's not clear how America can really counteract that, particularly since their allies are not that keen to join them in naval patrols that will antagonize China.
Yeah, there are these differences that you talk about, the differences, well, South China Sea, the DPRK, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, their missile program, the nuclear program. There's differences on trade as well. But we see a meeting that just took place between President Trump and President Xi Jinping. Does that suggest to you that both sides want to get together? They want to work this out?
Look, yeah, I mean, I think that the thing that certainly things that one can take comfort from. The first is that both sides, oddly enough, and I mean, I know why I should take comfort in the fact they're both nuclear weapons states, but I think it is important because it makes it almost unthinkably dangerous for them to go to war, and they both know that. I think the second thing is that there are, as the Chinese like to say, win-win elements to this relationship. Right. Economically, China is a huge market for American companies. For example, KFC sell more chicken in China than in the US, and Apple sell more iPhones there than in the US. So they have a stake in not disrupting it. And indeed, although Trump has been very negative at times about China's impact on the American economy, it is a case that a lot of goods are much, much cheaper for American consumers because they're manufactured in China. I mean, I think the significance, though, of this Trump-Xi meeting, which has took place just a couple of days before we were talking, is that if you took Trump's campaign rhetoric literally, you're heading for confrontation with China, no doubt about it. Mainly on the economy, where he talked about huge tariffs on Chinese goods. But then even in the first stages of administration, Rex Tillerson was making pretty bellicose sounds about the South China Sea. There was the famous phone call with the president of Taiwan. So you looked like, say in January, Feb, that you were heading for strategic and economic confrontation with China. But in fact, the first summit was much more conciliatory than that, which just goes to show how completely unpredictable Donald Trump is. But I think that one of the things that sort of symbolized in a funny way for me was that one of the many things that Trump said about China during the campaign is, you know, I'm not going to give banquets for the Chinese leader. I'm going to take him to McDonald's, and then sort of shout at him about trade. And in fact, of course, he gave him a banquet at Mar-a-Lago with Dover sole seared in champagne, which seemed quite a long way from a Big Mac.
And as this new world evolves, what about organizations like the United Nations or the IMF? What kind of role will they play? Do they have a future?
Yeah, I think they have a future, but I think their legitimacy, I mean, you have to take it institution by institution, but their legitimacy is broadly in question because essentially the architecture of global governance was put in place in 1945 after a victory in the Second World War, which of course China was part of, fortunately, because that means that they are permanent members of the UN Security Council, one of the 5 permanent members. And I think if that were not the case, the UN Security Council's legitimacy would be really shot. But as it is, even so, it's a slightly peculiar that you have 3 European states, Russia, France, Britain, the US and China, but you know, you probably should have another Asian country, at least one, probably an African country, and so on. So it's not fully representative. And the IMF and the World Bank were too slow to reform, frankly. They're dominated by Western voting blocs, which no longer reflects the weight in the global economy. And I think the Chinese got fed up of waiting for that long-promised reform and set up the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in Beijing, which has just got going. The Americans, in a rather kind of, I think they would now accept, ham-fisted way, attempted to block the AIIB. Yeah. And then America's allies all signed up, led actually by Britain. And now the AIIB is up and going. And I think that the Americans, as I say, I think, you know, they should have been more accepting and forgiving of that. And it will be very interesting to see how it goes, though, because it's early days. Will it really become the financier of the One Belt, One Road initiative and a rival source of authority and development thinking to the World Bank? It could well happen.
When you talk about America's decline, you referred to this earlier on. You talked about some of the wounds that America sustained being self-inflicted. Let's look at the wars that America got involved in. How has it hurt America?
Well, I think in retrospect, all but the biggest diehards would say the Iraq War was a mistake, in the sense that the vision that they had, which was to overthrow Saddam and set up a nice kind of liberal democracy which would be peaceful, prosperous, and allied to America, it hasn't worked. A lot of people died, many thousands of Americans and many, many more Iraqis. And the whole region is destabilized, not solely because of the Iraq War, because you also had then the Arab Spring and so on. But I think that war damaged lots of things. It damaged the stability and peace of the Middle East. It damaged America's global reputation because of the way it was, didn't really command international assent. It wasn't in response to an aggression, which therefore made it much more controversial than it might have been. And it also damaged America's sense of its own role in the world. I mean, I think some of the isolationism that Donald Trump was preaching, at least when he was a candidate, flows directly from the response to the Iraq War in the sense that why are we doing this? It's not really in our interests anymore. So America is less certain about its role in the world, its power's been sapped, and its legitimacy has been damaged as well. So yeah, the Iraq War was I think, all round a big mistake, but it was partly, very largely, a response to the shock that had been administered to America by 9/11, by the terrorist attacks then. And I think it destabilized the country and led it off in a dangerous direction.
And talk about unintended consequences. I mean, there are political groups here in Washington, in the United States, that feel that while America and its allies were bogged down in that war in the Middle East, in Iraq and in Afghanistan as well, it gave China the opportunity to grow. It's sometimes referred to as the strategic window of opportunity, that here was China looking at this and able to form these economic alliances, develop its infrastructure, and become the power that it is today?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that one of the patterns in American foreign policy is that American leaders can, if they have time to sit down and think, can see that the big challenge to their global position is not in the Middle East. It's in Asia, because that is where wealth and power is being accumulated. And so actually Bush, shortly before 9/11, was all preparing to focus on Asia more as his foreign policy. Then Obama comes in 2008 and says, as I've just said, the Iraq War was a mistake and we should focus more on Asia. He's the first US president to actually say Asia should be the primary focus of our foreign policy. And yet even he finds it very hard to follow through because of the turmoil in the Middle East. Because, okay, he scales back in Iraq and Afghanistan, but then you have the Arab Spring, you have the outbreak of the Syrian civil war, the revolution in Egypt. And so it's like a constant headache. And, almost symbolically, he keeps having to postpone trips to Asia because there's some crisis that's happened in the Middle East. And it reminds me of the line in the Godfather movie where the Godfather says, every time I think I'm out, it pulls me back in. Right. And that was the case with the Middle East.
We've been talking about America's decline. It's in the subtitle of your book, America's Decline. But this changing world, how has it affected Europe?
Look, I think that actually the sense of decline in Europe is much more accentuated than it is in the United States. And I think that, in a way, it's part of America's problem, is that if you think of the West, it's really got two pillars. One is the United States, but the other is the European pillar, the European Union and the countries around it. And ever since the financial crisis, which then translated into a crisis in the European single currency, and America's economy bounced back much faster than that of the Europeans, albeit with sort of unequal growth. Right. The Europeans have got very, very high unemployment, certainly in Southern Europe, and are continuing questions about the survivability of the single currency. So Europe's become very introverted and much less willing to play a role globally, much less able and interested in doing that. And that's a problem for America because, say, if you look at the NATO alliance, in 2000, 50% of the spending, military spending in NATO was the US, but 50% was the European allies. And it's now over 70% America. And the Americans are, perhaps understandably, getting annoyed by this because, essentially, it's an alliance that defends Europe.
That's right. Donald Trump has been complaining about that. Gideon Rachman, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And that's it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks for being with us.